From the types of trees and over-the-top pranks involving polar bears to music and literature, this is everything I could find that J.r.r. Tolkien loved. There is no better place to start when talking about the professor than language, or rather, languages. What started as a childhood love brought about by his mother's Greek and Latin lessons evolved into a truly lifelong passion that shaped his life. In varying degrees of fluency, Tolkien was able to read, understand, and speak English, French, German, Spanish, Greek, Finnish, Welsh, and Italian, while simultaneously delving deep into the language of the Anglo-Saxons, Middle English, Old Norse, and many, many more. This fascination with language and different cultures made him inherently fascinated by the history of those languages too, and by extension, the history of their peoples. This, of course, was an endless cycle which then saw Tolkien even more excited about learning new languages. In fact, while still a young boy already fascinated by linguistics, he encountered his first made-up language, Animalic, which was invented by his cousins, Mary and Marjorie. This experience started a journey, and perhaps Tolkien's longest-running hobby, of inventing entirely new languages throughout his life, starting with Nefbosh and especially Nafarin during his early years. He would go on to construct entirely new alphabets too, and of course, the next logical step was connecting his love of new languages to his love of literature, and the rest is history. Naturally, this intense love for language was paired with his equally passionate love for literature. Tolkien would write poems from a very young age, as well as his own stories. He would meet up with his friends and discuss what they were currently reading or working on for the majority of his life, whether that be through the Inklings alongside C.S. Lewis or his old friend group back in his school days. This passion is usually where a lot of his more unforgiving opinions came from, but always from a place of care and love for the incredible thing that was literature and storytelling. With that said, another equally important piece for the puzzle that was Tolkien the author was history and myths. During his formative years, he would spend endless hours reading what he could of the Old Norse myths and English history, and he immediately fell in love. Tolkien claimed to be moved by history, and especially when it could shine light on matters of language and lead to discovering new things. The medieval tales of princes and princesses, mighty kings, dragons, and dragon slayers, but also the stories of mystical creatures consumed his imagination. And in this process, he always felt that something was missing from his own beloved homeland, whose myths had not survived to the extent of other European mythologies. All of these loves, these passions that he had of language, of literature, history, and myths would go on to serve as the creative foundation and, most importantly, motivation for the creation of his future masterpiece. And this love of fairy tales, in an age in which these stories were increasingly being changed for commercial reasons, was precisely why he claimed to have loathed the works of studios like Disney, because he cared for children and their development. His masterpiece, and his writings in general, which included the unpublished Silmarillion, were nothing without their themes that came from the love and passion not of Tolkien the author, but of Tolkien the man, the husband, and the father. Young Catholic Ronald was only 16 years old when he met this older Protestant girl at the boarding house where he was residing alongside his brother. He and Edith, both orphans, would spend endless time together, and within only a year, the pair knew that they were deeply in love. However, Tolkien's Catholic guardian and protector following his mother's death, Father Francis Morgan, disapproved of this relation and forbade Tolkien from continuing to see the girl until he was 21, which Tolkien reluctantly obeyed. Having waited years, on the day of his 21st birthday, Ronald wrote to Edith and declared that his love had never ceased throughout these long years and that he wished to marry her. Edith, who was 3 years older than him, replied that she had already accepted a proposal from another man, thinking that Ronald had forgotten her. Seeing that this wasn't the case, however, Edith immediately returned her engagement ring and called everything off, met with Tolkien, and the two became engaged, even agreeing to convert to Catholicism despite her hesitation and family's anti-Catholic sentiment. It was while they were still engaged that J.r.r. Tolkien was sent to the Western Front of the First World War, where he expected to be killed in France. Following a harrowing experience and a near touch with death, and the loss of all except one of his childhood friends, Tolkien eventually made it home, always with Edith in his heart and mind. The two would go on to finally marry in 1916. Following the death of his love in 1971, Tolkien would write, "I never called Edith Luthien, but she was the source of the story that in time became the chief part of the Silmarillion. It was first conceived in a small woodland glade filled with hemlocks at Roos in Yorkshire, where I was for a brief time in command of an outpost of the Humber garrison in 1917, and she was able to live with me for a while. In those days, her hair was raven, her skin clear, her eyes brighter than you have seen them, and she could sing and dance. But the story has gone crooked, and I am left, and I cannot plead before the inexorable Mandos." His love for Edith was beyond words, and the absolute center of his passion project of the Silmarillion was the love story of the immortal maiden Luthien, the most beautiful woman to ever exist, and of the mortal Baron, who would sacrifice everything in the world to be with his love, even despite everyone's disapproval. Today, if you visit their tombstones, you will see etched next to their names, Beren and Luthien. But how can we talk of love, and especially love that influenced his work, without talking of his children too? Tolkien was a loving and dedicated father that went above and beyond to create a magical childhood for his children through his skills. The letters of Father Christmas are a notable and emotional example of this, in which every year, for decades and for every one of his children, he would write intricate stories, paint illustrations, and create languages to entertain his children during the holidays. And even beyond this, an even more notable example is of course The Hobbit itself, which also began as a story Tolkien made up for his boys. There would certainly not be a Hobbit sequel in the form of The Lord of the Rings if there was no Hobbit to begin with. The final piece of Tolkien the man, especially in reference to his work, is of course Tolkien's faith, for which I'm sure I have exhausted you at this point. It has to be said though how devout Tolkien was, and how his faith was directly connected to the love he held for his mother, who died so young and who was treated so unfairly due to her own faith, with Tolkien even calling her a saint within his letters. His concern for his fellow man, his hate of racism and discrimination of all kinds, was directly connected to his genuine belief that all of mankind were God's children, and he was incredibly distressed at the horrible news that had filled the headlines of his time, especially during the wars. Notably calling out those that would call for all Germans to be exterminated, seeing the hypocrisy of such statements for what they were, inhuman. Tolkien also genuinely loved his friends, and he was noted for his heartfelt regret whenever he would say something over the top, as he sometimes did in his exaggeration. A notable example, of course, is his friendship to C.S. Lewis, and how it had cooled for a long time before Lewis's own death, something that Tolkien had deeply regretted. Moving on, Tolkien absolutely loved the environment and adored what he saw as the traditional English countryside that was increasingly at risk by the rapid industrialization of the 20th century. This is one of the reasons why he heavily disliked the mass production and spread of motor vehicles, even though as an individual he actually really enjoyed and loved driving his car, even if, according to some sources, he was not very good at it. In Tolkien's own words in describing himself from letter 213, "I am in fact a hobbit in all but size. I like gardens, trees and unmechanized farmlands. I smoke a pipe and like good plain food, unrefrigerated, but detest French cooking. I like and even dare to wear in these dull days ornamental waistcoats. I am fond of mushrooms out of a field, have a very simple sense of humor, which even my appreciative critics find tiresome. I go to bed late and get up late when possible. I do not travel much. I love Wales and especially the Welsh language, but I have not in fact been in Wales for a long time, except for crossing it on the way to Ireland. I go frequently to Ireland, being fond of it and of most of its people, but the Irish language I find wholly unattractive." In his letters, Tolkien also revealed how much he loved and truly appreciated music, and especially classical music. And more so than that, how much he appreciated musicians especially, and how they were able to masterfully play their instruments, something that he himself was never able to do despite taking lessons. Of classical composers, he loved Sibelius, Chopin and Weber, though he is also said to have appreciated some light ballads too. And for some lighter facts, Tolkien loved typewriters and what they could do, even wishing he could get an electric one with a Fëanorian script on it so he could write in Elvish. The professor enjoyed some good champagne for the holidays. He notably loved smoking his pipe and would often smoke it when he was feeling especially nervous, such as in an interview. Tolkien, of course, also had a favorite type of tree, or at least one of his favorites was the famous black pine at the Oxford Botanic Garden, which came to be known as Tolkien's tree, or Laocoon, which was the name given to it by the professor. It was next to this beloved tree, in fact, that Tolkien had his very last photograph taken, less than a month before his death in 1973. Reportedly planted in 1799, Laocoon was cut down in 2014 to much opposition by the public. In the spirit of the Lady Yavanna, however, a sapling of that very same tree was planted again at Oxford in 2021. Speaking of Oxford, Tolkien loved being a professor. Though he sometimes found grading rather boring, that's how he actually first conceived of "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," which he wrote on a student's blank paper. The next thing he had to do was figure out what a hobbit was, and that is how The Hobbit, first as a bedtime story and then as a book, was created. During his time as a professor, Tolkien was noted for his passion, for his beautiful reciting of Beowulf, and of his dedication to his craft, often giving dozens upon dozens of more lectures than he was actually required by the university. Now, let's talk about one of my favorite facts about Tolkien. While he may seem like this calm and learned professor, he absolutely loved pranking people. Notably, according to his biography, he went to a party alongside C.S. Lewis dressed as polar bears, in a non-costume party, or another time in which he would dress up as an Anglo-Saxon warrior, axe and all, and chase his neighbors down. As if this wasn't enough, during his lectures, he was also known for suddenly pulling a green shoe out of his pocket and declaring to his stunned students that leprechauns did in fact exist. Or, even more hilariously, as an old man, he would give shopkeepers some of his false teeth alongside the change to see if they'd notice. Anglo-Saxon, axe-wielding Tolkien chasing down an unsuspecting neighbor must have been a sight to behold. Nevertheless, perhaps this love for pranks may not be so surprising, considering that when they were young, he and Edith were also known for sitting at any tea shop they could find, with a balcony over a busy street, and throwing sugar lumps into the hats of the strangers beneath. Lastly, Tolkien is noted for his strict opinions and especially high standards when it came to matters of literature, and so these are some of his favorite authors and works. He enjoyed William Morris, the Brothers Grimm, George MacDonald's, and works such as The Princess and the Goblin, which was certainly an influence on his works, as well as Lord Dunsany's The King of Elfland's Daughter. Moreover, even though he did not particularly like his friend's Narnia series, he did seem to really enjoy and greatly contribute to C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, which, in case you didn't know, was born out of a bet between the two men. Other of his favorite writings include much of the ancient classics such as Homer, Western medieval tales, the sagas, the Kalevala, and especially Beowulf, in which he contributed greatly through his own writings and translations. To some people's shock, Tolkien is also noted as enjoying the works of Mary Renaud, who was a former student of his and a well-known lesbian writer, whose works delved into some very progressive themes that the traditionalist Tolkien did not seem to mind, at least on a literary level. All in all, Tolkien, like all of us, was a complex individual, with his own likes and dislikes, as well as equally complex reasons behind his opinions. While he was, in many ways, against the trends of his time and very opinionated, it was almost always because he simply cared deeply about the subjects that he was talking about. The people who knew him remember him as a light-hearted man who had this cheeky sense of humor, despite being very serious regarding things he truly cared about. And I hope in this video I've shown a little more of who Tolkien truly was, and, while not truly everything, at least some of the things that he loved. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.